Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Marcus had been a ranger at Superior National Forest for 19 years, and he'd learned that most missing person cases ended in one of three ways. The lost hiker stumbled out dehydrated and embarrassed. A body was recovered from a fall or exposure, or the wilderness simply kept what it had taken. He'd seen all three outcomes enough times to approach each new case with the same methodical detachment that had earned him a reputation as the best tracker in northern Minnesota. The call about Sophia Chen came through dispatch at 4:47 a.m. on February 3, 2007. A University of Minnesota graduate student, 22 years old, studying ethnobotany. She'd been solo camping near the Kawashiwi River Basin for the past 4 days, researching winter-dormant plant species for her thesis. Her advisor had expected a check-in call on February 1st. When Sophia missed a second scheduled contact, the university notified the authorities. Marcus stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the ranger station parking lot, loading his pack with practiced efficiency. His breath formed thick clouds in the -15-degree air. The weather had been brutal this winter, even by Boundary Water standards. 3 feet of snow had fallen in January alone, and the ice on the lakes was nearly 30 inches thick. Not ideal conditions for a solo camper, but Sophia's permits were in order, and her wilderness experience was documented as extensive. Solo female, winter camping, 4 days overdue. Deputy Tom Bergstrom stamped his feet against the cold, his face ruddy beneath his fur-lined hat. You thinking what I'm thinking? Marcus zipped his pack closed. I'm thinking she's probably fine. Probably broke her sat phone or the cold drained the battery. We'll find her at her camp, annoyed that we interrupted her research. But even as he said it, Marcus felt the familiar weight of doubt. 4 days was a long time, and something about this case bothered him, though he couldn't articulate what. Maybe it was the timing. The last communication had been on Candlemas February 2nd, though he only knew that because his ex-wife used to mark all the old holidays. Or maybe it was the location Sophia had listed on her permit, the western shore of Lake Insula, an area the old Ojibwe families still avoided, though when pressed they'd only say the land remembered too much. Marcus had dismissed such talk as superstition for years. The Boundary Waters was his territory, and he knew every mile of it through reason and experience, not folklore. The drive to the trailhead took 90 minutes, the forest road barely passable despite his truck's 4-wheel drive. They parked at the Kawashiwi access point, just as gray dawn began filtering through the dense pine canopy. Marcus and Tom would hike in together, covering the 8 miles to Sophia's last known coordinates. The plan was simple: locate her camp, assess the situation, radio for additional support if needed. The snowshoes crunched rhythmically as they pushed into the wilderness. The forest was absolutely silent, unnaturally so. In 19 years, Marcus had never experienced such profound quiet. No birds, no wind. Even their voices seemed muffled, as if the snow itself absorbed sound. Tom noticed it too, growing quieter as they progressed until they traveled in complete silence broken only by their breathing and footfalls. 3 hours in, they found the first sign. Marcus almost missed it, just a discoloration in the snow near a lightning-scarred birch. He knelt, brushing away the powdery surface layer to reveal what lay beneath. Blood, frozen solid, mixed with something else. Hair, a lot of it, dark and human, torn out in clumps. The blood spatter pattern suggested violence, but there was something wrong about it. The distribution didn't match any animal attack Marcus had seen, and he'd documented hundreds. This was messier, more chaotic, frenzied. Jesus Christ, Tom muttered, hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. Bear? Wrong season, and bears don't. Marcus trailed off, studying the scene more carefully. Deep gouges in the birch bark, far too high for any Minnesota predator. 10, maybe 12 feet up. The marks were fresh, the exposed wood still white, and there were prints in the snow, human-sized, human-shaped, but wrong. The spacing was too long, the depth uneven, as if something had been walking on all fours before rising to bipedal stance. The gait pattern made no sense. Marcus photographed everything methodically, his hands steady despite the growing unease in his gut. He was a man of evidence, of rational explanation. There would be an answer. There was always an answer. They pressed on, following a trail that became increasingly disturbing. More blood, spattering the pristine snow in intermittent bursts. Scraps of clothing, expensive winter gear, shredded. A broken tent pole embedded in a tree trunk with enough force to split the wood. And everywhere those wrong footprints meandering through the forest with no apparent destination, sometimes on 2 legs, sometimes 4, sometimes showing signs of dragging something heavy. It was Tom who found the backpack, partially buried in snow near a frozen creek. The fabric was torn, the frame bent. Inside, a ruined laptop, waterlogged notebooks, a broken satellite phone, and a journal, miraculously intact in a waterproof pouch. Marcus opened it carefully, his fingers already numb despite his gloves. The early entries were exactly what he'd expected. Academic observations about plant dormancy, weather patterns, soil pH levels. Sophia's handwriting was precise, methodical, a kindred spirit, he thought. Someone who understood the world through data and documentation. But the later entries changed. January 31st. Something keeps circling my camp at night. Can't get a clear look. Movement is wrong. Too fast, too fluid. We'll set up camera trap tomorrow. February 1st. Camera showed nothing, but I heard it, breathing outside my tent, snuffling. It smells like rot and freezer burn. The Ojibwe ranger at the station warned me about this area. Said something in Ojibwe. Windiguasan. I looked it up. Wendigo stone. Wendigo land. I laughed at her. I shouldn't have laughed. February 2nd. It spoke to me, in my mother's voice. My mother is dead. It knew things only she would know. I'm leaving at first light, need to get out. The hunger is... The entry ended mid-sentence in a long smear of ink. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was a rational man. He'd spent 2 decades in these woods and never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by biology, weather, or human error. But the fear in those words was real. And something had happened to Sophia Chen. "We need to find her camp," he said, his voice harder than intended. "Now." The terrain grew more difficult as they approached Lake Insula. The snow deepened and the trees seemed to lean inward, their branches interlocking overhead to block what little sunlight penetrated the overcast sky. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, fighting an irrational certainty that they were being watched. They found Sophia's camp just before noon, and Marcus understood immediately that this was no longer a rescue operation. The tent was destroyed, not torn by wind or collapsed by snow, but shredded from the inside out. The fabric hung in ribbons from bent poles. Supplies were scattered across a 20-yard radius, food torn open and gnawed, equipment smashed, clothing strewn and frozen stiff. The camp stove was overturned, fuel crystallized in the snow, and blood. So much blood, painted in arcs across the white canvas of snow, frozen in grotesque patterns that suggested something impossible. But there was no body. Tom radioed for backup while Marcus documented the scene, his camera clicking mechanically as his mind tried to process what he was seeing. The blood volume suggested fatal injury, but the distribution made no sense. It covered too much area, as if someone had been... He forced the thought away. There had to be a rational explanation. Then he found the marks in the center of the destroyed camp. Someone had drawn symbols in the snow, crude circles and radiating lines surrounded by what looked like Ojibwe syllabics. He recognized a few: Windigu, Majimanidu, evil spirit, Wabano, dawn. The drawings were burned into the snow, blackened as if seared by heat. Impossible in this temperature. In the center was a spiral pattern, and Marcus realized with growing horror that it was made from what looked like finger bones, arranged in a deliberate design. "Marcus," Tom's voice was tight. "You need to see this." The deputy was standing at the tree line, pointing into the forest. Marcus joined him and felt his mouth go dry. Bones hung from the pine branches like macabre ornaments, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, suspended on what looked like sinew, not fresh kills. These were old, yellowed, some still connected by desiccated tissue. Animal skeletons mostly. Deer, moose, smaller mammals. But interspersed among them were others. Human skulls, femurs, rib cages. Some were ancient, the bone porous and crumbling. Others were fresher. "This is..." Tom couldn't finish the sentence. He looked green despite the cold. "A hunting ground," Marcus heard himself say. "We're in something's hunting ground." The rational part of his mind rebelled against the words even as he spoke them. But another part, something older, something that remembered when humans were prey, knew the truth. They needed to leave. Now. The crack of breaking ice shattered the silence. Both men spun toward the sound. Lake Insula stretched beyond the trees, its surface a white expanse broken by pressure ridges and wind-sculpted drifts. Something was moving out there, visible only as a disturbance in the snow, a wake of powder rising as if something large was running across the ice at impossible speed, coming toward them. "Back to the trail," Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice level. "Move, now." They ran, snowshoes clattering, abandoning any pretense of protocol. Behind them, the sound of something crashing through the forest grew louder, impossibly loud, as if an entire herd of elk was charging through the undergrowth. But Marcus knew, with terrible certainty, that it was singular. One thing, one very large, very fast thing that had been waiting for them to find the camp. The lure. It had been a lure. Tom stumbled, went down hard. Marcus hauled him up, and that's when he saw it. 20 yards behind them, barely visible through the dense pines, something stood upright. Tall, 8 feet, maybe more. Skeletal thin but radiating power, its movements twitchy and wrong, like a video played at the wrong speed. The shape was almost human, but the proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, torso too narrow, head too large. And the eyes. Marcus had seen predator eyes before. Wolf eyes, bear eyes, mountain lion eyes. But this was different. These eyes held intelligence, malevolence, and hunger. Such desperate, endless hunger that Marcus felt it like radiation, like heat, even across the distance. The thing's mouth opened, and Marcus saw teeth. Too many teeth, rotting and broken but still sharp, still functional. And then it spoke. Marcus's. His name, stretched and distorted, spoken in a voice he recognized. His daughter's voice. His daughter, who was safe in Duluth, a college freshman, but hearing her voice here in this thing's mouth broke something fundamental in his understanding of reality. "Help me, Daddy. I'm so cold. I'm so hungry." Tom fired his service weapon, 3 shots that echoed through the silent forest. The thing flinched but didn't fall. Instead, it tilted its head with terrible curiosity, and then it was moving, faster than anything that size should move, flowing between the trees like smoke. They ran harder, lungs burning in the frigid air. Marcus's rational mind gibbered protests. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But his body understood what his mind refused to accept. They were being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. The GPS beacon. Marcus's hand shook as he activated the emergency locator. Help was coming. They just had to survive until then. The forest seemed to close around them, the trees growing denser despite the open trail. No, that was wrong. There was no trail. When had they lost the trail? Marcus spun, trying to orient himself, but every direction looked the same. The GPS showed them moving in circles, tracking over their own path, though they'd been running in a straight line. The land itself was wrong. Wendigo-asen, Marcus whispered, understanding flooding through him. Wendigo land, not just a hunting ground. The territory itself had been corrupted, transformed. The Ojibwe had known. They'd tried to warn people. All those missing person cases over the decades, the ones that never made sense. The ones where searchers found nothing despite clear weather and good tracking conditions. Not accidents. Never accidents. A scream split the air, high and piercing, cutting through Marcus's thoughts. Tom's scream, but Tom was right next to him, white-faced and silent. The scream came again from 3 different directions at once, shifting pitch and tone. Sometimes Tom's voice, sometimes Marcus's own voice, sometimes Sophia's voice pleading for help. "Don't listen," Marcus gasped. "It's trying to separate us. Stay close." But it was too late. When Marcus looked back, Tom was gone. Not fallen behind, simply vanished, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. One moment there, the next moment nothing but empty snow and silent trees. Marcus was alone. He forced himself to stop running, to think. He'd survived 19 years in this wilderness through knowledge and preparation, not panic. There had to be a way out. The thing, the Wendigo, his mind finally acknowledged, was playing with him, hurting him. So he needed to stop being hurted, needed to do something unexpected. The ranger training came back. When lost, find a landmark, establish position, wait for rescue. But this wasn't lost. This was hunted. Different rules. Marcus remembered the journal. Sophia's last entry. The hunger is... She'd been studying ethnobotany, indigenous practices. Maybe she'd learned something, found something. The symbols in the destroyed camp hadn't been random panic. They'd been attempted protection. It hadn't worked, but maybe she'd gotten it wrong. Maybe there was a way. He pulled out his own emergency kit, hands shaking, and found the book he kept there. A field guide to Ojibwe culture, given to him years ago by an elder who'd patiently explained the names of places, the stories behind landmarks. He'd kept it as a professional courtesy, never thinking he'd need the sections on spiritual practices. The page on protective rituals was dog-eared. Someone, that same elder, Mary Kingbird, had written notes in the margin. For Wendigo, sacred tobacco, eastern cedar, fire blessed at sunrise. Speak its true name 3 times. Do not run, it feeds on fear. Do not run, it feeds on fear. Marcus had been running. They'd all been running. That's why it kept chasing. That's why it grew stronger. The hunger fed on terror as much as flesh. The forest had grown darker, though his watch showed it was only mid-afternoon. Snow began falling again, thick flakes that obscured visibility. Marcus could hear it circling that thing, breathing wetly in the darkness between trees, sometimes close, sometimes distant. The psychological warfare of an apex predator. He gathered what he needed, dried cedar from a grove nearby, tobacco from his emergency rations. He'd carried it for years for ceremonial offerings, standard practice in areas with indigenous heritage sites. Fire would be harder. His lighter fluid was nearly frozen. The breathing grew louder, closer. Marcus could smell it now. Sophia had been right. Rotten freezer burn, the stench of old death and corruption. His hands shook as he arranged the materials, trying to remember the proper way to construct the offering. "I know you're there," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I know what you are." The breathing stopped. Silence. Complete and total silence. More terrifying than the sounds had been. "Wendigo," Marcus said, the Ojibwe word feeling strange on his tongue. Spirit of hunger, spirit of winter. Movement. A branch snapped. The thing was right behind him. Every instinct screamed at Marcus to turn, to run, to fight. But he forced himself to stay still, forced himself to light the offering with trembling hands. The cedar caught, smoking in the cold air. The tobacco smoldered. "Wendigo," he said again. "I see you. I name you." A sound behind him, wet, rattling, breathing directly on his neck, close enough that he could feel the cold emanating from it. A cold deeper than winter. Absolute zero. The cold of death itself. "Wendigo," Marcus said the 3rd time, his voice barely a whisper. The thing screamed. Not a human scream, not an animal scream. Something else entirely. A sound that Marcus felt in his bones, in his teeth. A frequency that humans weren't meant to hear. The forest itself seemed to shudder, and then light, blinding white light that erupted from the offering, from the fire, spreading outward in a wave. Marcus collapsed, snow cold against his face, vision swimming. When he could see again, the forest had changed. The oppressive darkness had lifted. The trees no longer seemed to lean inward. And lying 10 feet away, half buried in snow, was a body. Sophia Chen looked like she'd been dead for weeks, not days. Her skin was waxy, gray, lips pulled back from her teeth in a frozen grimace. But she was intact, not torn apart, not consumed. And carved into the snow beside her body, in the same blackened style as the symbols at the camp, was a message in English. Still hungry. The rescue helicopter found Marcus 2 hours later, hypothermic but alive, sitting beside Sophia's body. He'd kept the fire burning with every piece of burnable material he had, whispering the name over and over, Windigo, Windigo, Windigo. They never found Tom Bergstrom. The search teams covered 50 square miles and found nothing. No tracks, no gear, no trace. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. Marcus told them about the attack, about the thing in the woods. But the official report listed Tom as missing, presumed dead from exposure. The prevailing theory was that Marcus had experienced a trauma-induced break from reality, that Sophia had died from hypothermia, that Tom had become disoriented and wandered off. The bone trees were attributed to unknown parties, possibly involved in illegal hunting. The symbols at the camp were noted as evidence of Sophia's psychological distress before her death. Rational explanations for everything. The system required rational explanations. Marcus returned to work after a month of mandatory leave. He resumed his duties, filed his reports, maintained his reputation for competence and reliability. But he never went back to Lake Insula. And on February 2nd every year, Candlemas, the old holiday, he drove to the Ojibwe Community Center in Ely and left an offering. Tobacco and cedar, properly prepared with a whispered name. Mary Kingbird was always there, waiting. She never said anything, just nodded once, accepting the offering. But the last time Marcus visited, she'd gripped his arm with surprising strength. "It's still there," she'd said, her eyes ancient and sad. "Still hungry. The land remembers. And winter comes every year." Marcus understood. The Windigo wasn't defeated, it was patient. It would wait. And someday someone else would camp on Lake Insula despite the warnings, despite the folklore. Someone else would violate the territory, and the cycle would continue. Because some hungers could never be satisfied. Some hungers were eternal. Marcus still dreams about it sometimes. That thing standing in the snow, wearing faces of people he loved, speaking with voices he treasured, and in those dreams, he hears what it whispered in those final moments before the light drove it back. "You named me, Marcus. Now I know you. Now I'll always know you. And winter is so very long." The rational part of his mind insists the dreams are just trauma, just his psyche processing impossible stress. But on the coldest nights, when the temperature drops below zero and the wind howls through the pines, Marcus wakes to the smell of rot and freezer burn. And he knows the truth. The wilderness always keeps what it takes. Sometimes it just takes longer than others. If this story sent chills down your spine, follow for more authentic, supernatural horror. Could you survive what Marcus faced? Did this story give you genuine terror? Which moment scared you most? The bone trees, the voice mimicry, or that final message in the snow? Share your thoughts. The rain came down in sheets that October morning, turning the Olympic National Park Ranger Station parking lot into a maze of puddles that reflected the bruised sky. Christopher Bennett pulled his SUV into the last available spot, killed the engine, and sat for a moment watching water stream down the windshield. He'd driven 7 hours from Seattle, fueled by coffee and the grim determination that came with coordinating search and rescue operations for the past 12 years. Missing person cases were his specialty. He'd found hikers who'd fallen off trails, tourists who'd gotten disoriented, even a few people who hadn't wanted to be found. His success rate spoke for itself, 87% recovery, and he intended to keep that number climbing. Emma Rodriguez had been missing for 4 days now. The 26-year-old doctoral candidate from the University of Washington had been conducting field research on endemic moss species in the Hoh rainforest when she'd failed to check in with her advisor. Her tent was still at the designated campsite, her equipment neatly organized, but Emma herself had vanished. The initial search teams had found nothing, no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of which direction she might have gone. That's when they'd called Chris. He gathered his waterproof jacket and laptop bag, then jogged through the downpour to the ranger station. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of burnt coffee and wet wool. A handful of rangers and volunteers clustered around a topographical map spread across a large table, their voices low and serious. Chris recognized the type immediately. Good people, dedicated, but operating on instinct and hope rather than systematic analysis. "Christopher Bennett," he announced, shaking rain from his jacket. "I'm here to coordinate the search." A woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun looked up. Her name tag read, Chief Ranger Sarah Mitchell. The lines around her eyes suggested someone who'd spent decades squinting into wilderness distances. "Thank God. We're running out of ideas here." Chris approached the table, his analyst's mind already cataloging the colored pins and marked zones on the map. "Walk me through everything. From the beginning." For the next hour, he absorbed information with the methodical precision that made him valuable. Emma had arrived 9 days ago, setting up base camp near the Hoh River Trail. She'd been communicating daily with her advisor via satellite phone. The cell service out here was non-existent. Her research focused on Isothecium myoceroides, a moss species that thrived in the unique microclimate of the temperate rainforest. She was experienced, careful, always filed her itinerary. The last communication was at 6:47 p.m. on October 14th, Ranger Mitchell said, tapping her finger on a notation. She mentioned wanting to explore an area off-trail the next morning, about 2 miles northwest of her camp. Said she'd seen some interesting growth patterns. Did she specify exact coordinates? No, just northwest, near the old growth section. Chris frowned. In a forest where trees grew 300 feet tall and the canopy blocked out most of the sky, northwest could mean 1,000 different locations. What about her gear? You said her tent was intact? Everything was there. Sleeping bag, personal items, even her research notes and samples from previous days. Her satellite phone was in the tent, fully charged. That made Chris pause. She went into the forest without communication? Apparently. Her day pack is missing, along with some basic supplies. Water, energy bars, first aid kit. But she left the sat phone. That doesn't make sense. Chris pulled out his own notebook, began making notes. An experienced researcher wouldn't go off trail without communication. What's the weather been like? Typical autumn, rain, some fog, temperatures in the 50s. Nothing extreme. Chris studied the map, his mind running probability algorithms. 4 days in mild weather, an experienced hiker should be survivable. But 4 days without contact suggested either injury or disorientation severe enough to prevent return, or something else. He pushed that thought away. Speculation without data was useless. "I want to see her campsite," he said, "and I need to review the search grid your teams have covered." The drive to the Hoh rainforest took 40 minutes on winding roads that cut through walls of green so dense they seemed to lean inward. Chris followed Ranger Mitchell's truck, noting how the forest changed as they penetrated deeper. The trees growing taller, thicker, the undergrowth more primordial. Nurse logs 6 feet in diameter lay decomposing, covered in ferns and new growth in a cycle that had repeated for millennia. The place had a weight to it, a sense of age that made his rational mind uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Emma's campsite sat in a small clearing 20 yards from the trail. The tent was a professional-grade 2-person model, still properly staked despite the rain. Chris pulled on latex gloves before entering, his movements careful and deliberate. Inside, Everything was organized with the precision of someone who understood field research. Notebooks stacked by date, specimen containers labeled in neat handwriting, clothing folded in stuff sacks. The sleeping bag showed signs of use, and a paperback novel, something about quantum physics, lay spine up on the ground pad. But it was the satellite phone that held Chris's attention. He picked it up, powered it on. Full battery, no missed calls, no unsent messages. Why would she leave it? "We bagged some items for analysis," Mitchell said from outside the tent. "Hair samples, fingerprints on surfaces, standard procedure." Chris emerged, looking around the clearing with fresh eyes. The ground was soft from constant rain and boot prints crisscrossed the area. Search teams, probably. Any tracks Emma might have left would be long gone. He walked a slow perimeter, examining the tree line. Nothing unusual. No broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth, no... Wait. About 30 feet from the tent, barely visible against a massive Sitka spruce, something had been carved into the bark. Chris approached slowly, his pulse picking up despite himself. The carving was crude but deliberate. A circle with lines radiating outward, and within the circle a symbol that looked vaguely like a stick figure with branching arms. "That's new," Mitchell said, coming up behind him. "That wasn't here when we processed the site 2 days ago." Chris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "You're certain?" "Positive. We photographed every inch of this clearing." He pulled out his phone, no signal as expected, and took several pictures with the camera. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still pale. Someone had made this recently. He reached out to touch it, then stopped himself. The symbol triggered something in his memory, some half-remembered lecture or article, but he couldn't place it. "Could be kids," Mitchell offered, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "We get some vandalism, urban explorers who don't respect wilderness areas. 2 miles from the nearest trailhead in active search territory?" Chris shook his head. "Unlikely." They spent another hour documenting the site before heading back to the ranger station. Chris's mind churned through possibilities, discarding scenarios that didn't fit the data. Emma was smart, experienced, and careful, yet she'd gone into the forest without communication. Her campsite showed no signs of hurried departure or distress, and now strange carvings were appearing near her abandoned tent. The pieces didn't fit any pattern he recognized, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Back at the station, Chris set up his laptop and began organizing the search data. He'd brought software that helped coordinate multiple teams, optimize search grids, and calculate probability zones based on terrain and human behavior. For 3 hours, he lost himself in the comfortable world of data analysis, where everything made sense and followed predictable patterns. Ranger Mitchell brought him coffee, actual good coffee, not the burnt sludge from earlier, around 4 p.m. "Find anything?" "Your teams have covered the most likely areas," Chris admitted. "But they've been searching for someone who's trying to be found. What if Emma went looking for something specific? Her moss research? Maybe. You said she mentioned interesting growth patterns. What if she found something unusual enough to make her deviate from protocol?" Mitchell considered this. "The old growth section northwest of her camp. There's an area in there locals call the Quiet Grove, named because even the birds don't go there. Too dark, too dense. Nothing for them to eat." Chris looked up from his screen. "Locals have a name for it?" "This forest is over 1 million acres. People who've lived here generations. They know spots that aren't on any map. The Quiet Grove is one of them. Basically a depression where the canopy is so thick almost nothing grows on the forest floor. Researchers usually avoid it because there's not much to study. But Emma was studying moss. Unusual growth patterns in low-light conditions might be exactly what she'd want to investigate. I'll check if that area's been covered." Mitchell moved to the map, running her finger across the northwestern quadrant. "Here. We skirted the edges but didn't go deep. The terrain's difficult, lots of deadfall, and the fog settles there even when the rest of the forest is clear." Chris stood, joining her at the map. "I want to go there tomorrow, first light. I'll assign you a team. Just one ranger. More people mean more noise, more disturbance. If there's evidence, I don't want it trampled. Mitchell studied him for a moment, then nodded. I'll take you myself. That night, Chris stayed in one of the ranger station's guest rooms, a Spartan space with a single bed and a window that looked out onto darkness so complete it seemed solid. He tried to sleep but kept seeing that carved symbol, his mind worrying at it like a loose tooth. Finally, around 2 a.m., he gave up and opened his laptop. Internet connectivity was spotty, but he managed to load a few academic databases. He searched for symbols, carved markings, indigenous art from the Pacific Northwest. The Kinal people had inhabited this region for thousands of years, and their artistic traditions were well documented. He scrolled through images of bentwood boxes, woven baskets, totem designs. Nothing matched. He broadened his search: shamanic symbols, animistic traditions, transformation rituals. The coffee had long since gone cold when he finally found something that made his breath catch. A scanned page from an anthropological text dated 1923, documenting problematic spiritual practices among Algonquian peoples of the northern forests. The author, a professor who'd clearly viewed indigenous traditions through a lens of colonial superiority, described symbols associated with what he called corrupted shamanic rites. There, in a grainy black and white photograph, was a symbol nearly identical to the one carved near Emma's tent. The text described it as a spirit-walking mark, used by shamans who sought to move between the physical and spiritual worlds. But this particular version, the author noted with anthropological disdain, was inverted or perverted, used not for healing or guidance but for predation. Shamans who violated sacred laws, who gave themselves over to base hungers, would mark their territories with these symbols as warnings. Chris closed the laptop harder than necessary. This was ridiculous. He was a rational man, a search and rescue coordinator who dealt in facts and evidence. Indigenous folklore, however fascinating from an academic standpoint, had no bearing on finding Emma Rodriguez. She was lost in the wilderness, possibly injured, and he needed to focus on systematic search patterns, not century-old anthropological texts about spirit walkers. But sleep wouldn't come. He lay in the dark listening to rain hammer the roof, and couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into something that didn't follow the rules he'd spent his career mastering. Dawn broke gray and reluctant. Chris met Ranger Mitchell at 6 a.m., both of them laden with packs containing water, first aid supplies, GPS units, emergency beacons, and enough gear to survive an unplanned night in the wilderness. The drive back to the Hoh rainforest felt longer in the pale morning light, the forest even more oppressive without the night to blame for its darkness. They hiked northwest from Emma's campsite, following a bearing toward the quiet grove. The trail disappeared after the first mile, forcing them to navigate through undergrowth and around massive fallen trees. The forest here was primordial, Sitka spruce and western hemlock towering overhead, their bark thick with moss, their branches so high and dense they blocked out the sky. Fungi grew in shelf-like formations from the trunks, some nearly a foot wide, colored in browns and whites that looked disturbingly organic. Watch your footing, Mitchell warned as they descended into a depression. The ground gets spongy here. She wasn't wrong. Each step sank slightly into the forest floor, which was thick with centuries of decomposed needles and organic matter. The smell changed too. Not unpleasant exactly, but heavy with decay and growth happening simultaneously. And it was quiet. Chris realized he couldn't hear birds, couldn't hear the small rustlings that usually accompanied forest hiking. Just their breathing, their footsteps, and the occasional drip of water from the canopy high above. They'd been hiking for 90 minutes when Chris spotted it, a piece of bright orange fabric snagged on a devil's club bush. He approached carefully, photographing it before touching. The fabric was wet, but not degraded, and the color matched the description of Emma's day pack. She came this way, Mitchell confirmed, examining the fabric without disturbing it. They marked the GPS coordinates and continued, moving more slowly now, eyes scanning for any other signs. Chris's analytical mind wanted to feel relief. This was progress, evidence, a concrete direction. But something about the quality of the light, the oppressive silence, made his chest tight. Another half hour brought them to what had to be the quiet grove. The forest opened into a wide depression maybe 100 yards across, ringed by ancient trees whose trunks were 6 feet in diameter. The canopy overhead was so thick that only a dim green twilight penetrated, and the forest floor was nearly bare, just soft earth and exposed roots twisting across the ground like veins. In the center of the depression, a cluster of stones had been arranged in a circle. Chris felt every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but he forced himself forward. This was just a geographical feature, just an arrangement of rocks. There was nothing objectively threatening here. Except there was. As they approached the stone circle, Chris saw more carvings on the surrounding trees. Dozens of them. All variations of that same symbol he'd seen near Emma's tent. Some were old, the exposed wood darkened with age. Others were fresh. And in the center of the stone circle, something had been burned recently enough that the smell of charred wood still lingered in the damp air. Jesus, Mitchell breathed. Chris, we need to call this in. But Chris was staring at the burned remains. Not wood, bones. Small ones, probably animal, arranged in a pattern. And something else. Something that made his stomach turn. A piece of fabric, singed but recognizable. The same orange as Emma's day pack. His hands shook as he pulled out his GPS unit to mark coordinates. This was evidence of a crime scene now, not just a missing person. They needed forensics, investigators, proper documentation. His role had just shifted from search coordinator to potential witness. Look at the trees, Mitchell said, her voice tight. The carvings. They're all facing inward toward the circle. Chris looked up, and she was right. Every symbol on every tree was oriented so that the stick figure element pointed toward the center of the grove, like an audience watching a performance, or markers directing something inward. We're leaving, he said. Now. We document what we found, bring in proper authorities. The sound cut him off, a sound that shouldn't exist, that his rational mind immediately tried to categorize as wind or an animal or anything except what it actually was. A voice, speaking in a language he didn't recognize, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Mitchell grabbed his arm. Tell me you heard that. Let's move. Chris's training kicked in. When situations become dangerous, extract immediately. They could return with a larger team with proper support. He turned back the way they'd come and stopped. The trees had changed. That was impossible. He knew it was impossible. But the arrangement of trunks and the pattern of roots looked different from how they'd appeared 5 minutes ago. The path they'd taken into the grove had somehow shifted. Chris. Mitchell's voice was very small. Which way did we come from? He checked his GPS. The coordinates placed them exactly where they'd been standing, but the digital compass was spinning lazily, unable to find north. He pulled out his backup compass, the reliable, magnetic, purely mechanical compass that had never failed him, and watched its needle rotate in slow circles, pointing at nothing. The voice came again, closer now. Still unintelligible, but with a cadence that suggested words, meaning, communication. And underneath it, a sound like branches scraping together, or bones clicking against bones. Whatever happens, Chris said, trying to keep his voice steady. Stay close. Don't run. Running triggers predator responses. Predator? Chris, what the hell are you talking about? There's nothing here that... She stopped because something moved at the edge of the grove. Not an animal. Not a person. Something that seemed to flow between the trees like smoke given form. And as it moved, the carved symbols on the trunks began to glow with a faint bioluminescent green. Every rational thought in Chris's mind screamed that this wasn't real. That it was a trick of light or stress-induced hallucination or anything except what his eyes insisted he was seeing. A figure, impossibly tall and impossibly thin, with proportions that hurt to look at. Its head, if that's what it was, seemed to be made of branches woven together, and where its eyes should be, there were hollow spaces that somehow suggested vision anyway. And it was looking at them. Mitchell made a sound like a wounded animal and did exactly what Chris had warned against. She ran. The figure's head tilted, tracking her movement, and then it was moving. Not running, but flowing through the space between the trees, cutting off her escape. Chris's hand found the bear spray on his belt. and he knew even as he pulled it free how useless it would be. This thing, whatever it was, didn't follow the rules. It existed in defiance of his entire understanding of reality, but Emma had been here. Emma had come to this place, and if there was any chance she was alive, any chance at all, he needed answers. What did you do with her? His voice came out steadier than he felt. The woman who was here, Emma Rodriguez. Where is she? The figure stopped moving. It stood at the edge of the clearing, swaying slightly, and when it spoke, the words came in layered voices, human and animal, and something else entirely. But now, somehow, Chris could understand them. She sought knowledge. She found knowledge. She learned what happens when boundaries are crossed. Where is she? The figure's branch-woven head tilted the other way, and Chris had the horrifying impression it was amused. She walks between. She sought to understand the transformation, and now she is the transformation. The forest claimed her, as it has claimed others, as it will claim you. I don't believe in... Chris started, but the words died in his throat because the figure was opening, unfolding, revealing the terrible truth at its center. It wasn't one thing. It was many things, fused together. Wood and bone and what might have been human once, twisted into a single entity that served as vessel for something ancient and hungry. Mitchell was screaming somewhere behind him, but Chris couldn't look away. The figure reached toward him with hands that had too many joints, and he saw the symbols, those damned symbols, carved into its palm. His mind, his beautiful, rational mind that had always been his greatest tool, finally broke. The data points wouldn't connect. The evidence contradicted fundamental laws of physics and biology. Everything he'd built his understanding of the world upon was dissolving like morning mist, and in its place was the terrible knowledge that he'd been wrong about everything. The forest wasn't neutral. It wasn't just a geographical feature with predictable patterns and navigable terrain. It was alive in ways science hadn't named, and it had rules that predated human understanding. Emma hadn't just gotten lost. She'd stumbled into something that existed in the spaces between conventional reality, and now it was offering him the same terrible education. She wanted to see the boundary between life and death, growth and decay, the figure said, and Chris realized with numb horror that its voice was gentle, almost kind. This place is that boundary, a shamanic realm where transformation is constant. Your friend understood too late that observation changes the observer. She tried to study the liminal spaces, and the liminal spaces claimed her. Show me, Chris heard himself say. Show me what happened to her. The figure considered this, its hollow eyes somehow conveying thought. Then it gestured toward the burned remains in the stone circle. Look closer, searcher. Use the sight you've always possessed but refused to acknowledge. Chris didn't want to. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, to join Mitchell wherever she'd gone, to escape this place and never return. But Emma deserved more than that. She'd come here seeking knowledge, and if understanding was the price of finding her, he'd pay it. He approached the circle, forcing his legs to move. Up close, he could see the bones weren't entirely animal. There were finger bones, human-sized, arranged with deliberate care, and the fabric wasn't just burned. It had been placed there intentionally, an offering or a marker. Then the bones moved. Chris jerked back, but it was too late. The burned remains were shifting, rearranging themselves, and between them, something was growing. Moss, but not the moss Emma had been studying. This was phosphorescent, pulsing with that same green light as the carved symbols. It spread quickly, covering the bones, covering the stones, reaching toward Chris's boots, and in the pattern of its growth he saw a face. Emma's face. Not dead, but transformed. Incorporated into the forest itself, her consciousness dispersed through the mycelial networks and moss colonies, part of the liminal realm between living and dying. She wasn't screaming. That was the most horrible part. Her expression in the moss pattern suggested understanding, even acceptance. She'd wanted to study the boundary, and now she existed within it. She can't come back, the figure said, its voice echoing in the enclosed space. The transformation is complete. She feeds the forest, and the forest preserves her knowledge. This is the way of the shamanic realm. The old practitioners understood sacrifice and transformation, death and rebirth, all occurring simultaneously. Chris felt something break inside him, something fundamental to his sense of self. All his careful analysis, all his systematic approaches, all his faith in rational thought, worthless in the face of this. Emma was here and not here, alive and not alive, and there was no search grid that could map this territory. Why? He managed. Why let this happen? She chose. She saw the symbols, understood their invitation, and chose to walk deeper, as all who come here eventually choose. The rational mind cannot long resist the call to understand, even when understanding means dissolution. The moss Emma's face was already fading, dispersing back into random patterns. Chris wanted to reach for it, to somehow pull her back from whatever existence she now occupied, but his hands wouldn't move. Because he knew, with terrible certainty, that touching the moss would mean joining her. "You can leave," the figure said, and now its tone was businesslike, almost bored. "Take your partner, return to the world of surfaces and certainty. Tell whatever story allows you to sleep at night. The forest will keep its secrets, and Emma Rodriguez will be filed as another missing person, eventually presumed dead. Your success rate will drop to 86.9%. This bothers you, I know." It did. Even now, even shattered and terrified, Chris's analyst mind was calculating the statistical impact. He'd built his career on finding people, and Emma would be his failure, his one that got away. The thought was almost unbearable. "Or," the figure continued, "you can stay. Learn what she learned. Join the transformation, and finally understand the patterns you've spent your life mapping. The forest offers knowledge that your world can't provide. Complete knowledge. Total understanding." For a moment, a terrible, tempting moment, Chris considered it. Wasn't that what he'd always wanted? To understand, to know, to have all the data? His life had been a quest for comprehension, for fitting chaos into logical frameworks. And here was something offering absolute knowledge, the kind that transcended human limitation. Then he heard Mitchell scream again, distant but real, and the sound snapped something back into place in his fractured mind. She needed him. He needed to get her out. Needed to make sure at least one person survived this horror show. Emma was lost, but Mitchell wasn't. Not yet. "I'm leaving," Chris said, and the words felt like defeat and victory simultaneously. "I'm taking Ranger Mitchell, and we're leaving this place." The figure made a sound that might have been laughter. "Then go, Christopher Bennett. Return to your comfortable delusions. But know this, you'll never forget what you saw here. Every search you conduct, every missing person you seek, you'll wonder if they found their way to a place like this. You'll question every unexplained disappearance, every case where the evidence just doesn't fit. The rational world you believed in is a thin shell over something much stranger, and now you know it. I can live with that. Can you? Time will tell." The figure stepped aside, and suddenly Chris could see the path they'd taken into the grove. It was exactly where it had always been, unchanged. The GPS coordinates on his unit stabilized, the compass needle found north, and the forest became just a forest again. Dark and old and silent, but comprehensible. He ran. Mitchell was crouched behind a fallen log 50 yards from the grove, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutching her radio like a lifeline, even though there was no signal this deep in. She looked up as Chris crashed through the undergrowth, and the relief in her eyes was profound. "We're going," he gasped. "Don't look back, don't stop. Just move." They did, running when they could, stumbling when they couldn't, putting distance between themselves and the quiet grove. Chris's GPS guided them back to Emma's campsite, and from there to the trail, and finally to the parking area where their vehicles waited in the gray afternoon light. Neither of them spoke during the drive back to the ranger station. What was there to say? Chris's hands shook on the wheel, and he kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that impossible figure flowing down the road behind them. At the station, Mitchell went straight to her office and closed the door. Chris heard her on the phone, calling for backup, reporting a situation, using careful words that didn't include impossible or supernatural. He should join her, should help file reports, should coordinate the next steps. Instead, he sat in his vehicle and stared at his laptop. He'd come here to find Emma Rodriguez. He'd failed. Whatever story they told, animal attack, fall into hidden ravine, disorientation leading to exposure, would be a lie. But it would be a lie the world could accept. The carved symbols on the trees would be dismissed as vandalism. The stone circle would be attributed to local teenagers or misguided tourists. The burned remains would be too degraded for identification, if they were even still there when investigators arrived. And Emma would join the statistics of unsolved disappearances, one more person swallowed by the vast wilderness. Chris opened his laptop and began typing his report. He documented the search grid, the discovery of fabric from Emma's pack, the difficult terrain. He recommended expanding the search to include water features, suggesting she might have fallen into the Ho River. He proposed bringing in cadaver dogs and aerial surveys. He wrote everything a professional search coordinator should write, leaving out every impossible detail. But in a separate file, encrypted and saved only to his local drive, he wrote the truth. Every word, every observation, every moment of horror. He didn't know why. It wouldn't help, wouldn't bring Emma back, wouldn't make him believe any less in what he'd seen. Maybe it was insurance, proof that he hadn't imagined it, or maybe it was a confession, an acknowledgement that he'd crossed a boundary he could never uncross. The figure had been right. His understanding of the world was forever shattered. Every future case would carry the shadow of this one. Every time coordinates didn't quite line up or evidence didn't quite fit, he'd wonder if there was a quiet grove somewhere, a liminal space where rational rules dissolved and ancient patterns still held power. 3 weeks later, the official search was called off. Emma Rodriguez was presumed dead, her body likely claimed by the wilderness. Her family held a memorial service. Her advisor published her preliminary research on moss species, dedicating it to her memory. The University of Washington established a scholarship in her name, and Christopher Bennett continued his work, coordinating search and rescue operations with the same systematic precision that had defined his career. His success rate dropped to 86.9%, just as predicted. He became known for his thoroughness, his refusal to give up easily, his almost obsessive need to find answers. But those who worked closely with him noticed changes. He no longer expressed complete confidence in his methods. He sometimes paused during searches, staring into tree lines as if listening for something, and he kept a collection of photographs on his encrypted laptop. Images of symbols carved into trees, patterns that appeared in moss growth, arrangements of stones in forest clearings. He never returned to Olympic National Park. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never be safely revisited. Sarah Mitchell remained a ranger for another year before taking early retirement. She moved to Arizona, as far from temperate rainforests as she could get, and refused to discuss what had happened in the quiet grove. Sometimes she woke gasping from dreams of figures made of branches, reaching toward her with too many joints in their hands. And deep in the Olympic National Forest, in a place too dark and too quiet, moss grew in patterns that occasionally resolved into a human face. Hikers who stumbled upon the quiet grove found themselves disoriented, their compasses spinning, their GPS units failing. Most made it out, reporting strange feelings and the sense of being watched. A few didn't. They joined Emma, transformed and incorporated into something that predated human understanding. The forest kept growing, kept changing, kept calling to those who sought knowledge beyond comfortable limits. And the symbols remained on the trees, warnings and invitations carved by hands that existed in the liminal spaces between what is and what should not be. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Chris's place? The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days, and Sophia Chen knew that was bad. Really bad. Water meant hypothermia, meant tracks washed away, meant a search grid that expanded exponentially with every passing hour. She pulled her Gore-Tex hood tighter as she studied the contour map spread across the hood of the search and rescue truck, rain drumming a relentless rhythm on the paper's laminated surface. Last known position here, Deputy Marshal Tom Hendricks jabbed a thick finger at a point deep in the Hoh Rainforest section of Olympic National Park. Girlfriend says Lucas Brennan was planning a solo summit attempt on Mount Olympus via the Hoh Lake Trail. That was 72 hours ago. He was supposed to check in yesterday morning. Sophia traced the route with her own finger, her analytical mind already calculating probabilities. Lucas Brennan, 34 years old, experienced mountaineer, carried proper gear according to his permit. The Hoh River Trail was challenging but well marked. Summit conditions had been marginal but not impossible 3 days ago, before the rain came. "Any emergency beacon activation?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Nothing. Phone's going straight to voicemail. Could be dead battery, could be no signal, could be..." "Let's not speculate," Sophia cut him off gently. She'd been doing this for 6 years, first with King County SAR, now as a civilian analyst with Olympic National Park's search operations. She'd learned early that speculation killed efficiency. You worked the data, followed the evidence, stayed rational. Panic saved no one. By noon, she was 4 miles into the temperate rainforest with a small team. Herself, Hendricks, and 2 volunteers from the Mountain Rescue Council. The Hoh Rainforest was primordial, a place where Sitka spruce grew 300 feet tall and moss covered everything in a carpet of green so thick it muffled sound. Beautiful and utterly indifferent to human life. Sophia's radio crackled. "Base, this is Team 1. We're at the 3-mile marker. No sign of subject. Continuing east toward Hoh Lake." She keyed her own radio. "Copy that, Team 1. Team 2 proceeding to Grid Sector 7. We'll check the high camps." The forest pressed in around them, dense and dripping. Sophia's breath misted in the 40-degree air. Her rational mind cataloged everything. The sound of the Hoh River rushing somewhere to their left, the particular way the light filtered green through the canopy, the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation. But something else nagged at her, something she couldn't quite categorize. An absence of sound, perhaps. No birds, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth. She pushed the thought away. Confirmation bias. She was looking for something wrong, so her brain was finding it. They found Lucas's first campsite just before 1400 hours, exactly where it should have been according to his permit. The tent was properly erected, guy lines tight, rain flies secure. But it was empty. "Looks like he packed up to move on," one of the volunteers observed. A younger guy named Chris, whose enthusiasm sometimes outpaced his judgment. Sophia knelt beside the tent, her gloved hands checking the zippers. "No, look. The zippers are open but from the outside, and the sleeping bag is still inside, still in its stuff sack." Hendricks frowned. "So he didn't pack up?" "No." Sophia's mind worked through the possibilities. Medical emergency requiring rapid evacuation. But his pack wasn't here either. Animal encounter forcing him to abandon camp. But there would be damage to the tent. Scatter patterns. This was orderly, too orderly. She circled the campsite in widening arcs, reading the ground. The rain had done its work, but there, boot prints, size 11 or 12, matching Lucas's gear list. Leading away from camp heading northwest, wrong direction for the summit trail. "He went off trail," she announced. "Why would an experienced hiker do that?" Chris asked. Sophia didn't answer because she didn't have an answer that made sense. You didn't leave a good camp in marginal weather to bushwhack through old-growth forest. Not if you were rational. They followed the tracks for half a mile before they found the first thing that made Sophia's analytical framework stutter. The boot prints simply stopped. Not faded, stopped. Mid-stride, as though Lucas had been plucked from the ground. Sophia knelt in the mud, examining the final print. The tread pattern was clear, the depth consistent with a weighted pack. And then nothing. Just undisturbed moss and fallen needles for yards in every direction. Could the rain have... Chris started. "No." Sophia's voice was flat. "You can see where the rain has affected the prints we followed. This is different. This is impossible. The word hung unspoken in the cold air. Hendricks keyed his radio. Base, Team 2. We have a situation at... He consulted his GPS. Coordinates 47.8162, minus 123.8694. Subject's tracks terminate without explanation, requesting additional units and air support if weather permits. While they waited, Sophia walked the perimeter again. 30 feet from the last print, she found something else. At first, she thought it was just a pattern in the moss, a trick of light and shadow. But when she knelt close, she saw them. Symbols. Carved into the bark of an enormous spruce tree, perhaps 8 feet off the ground. They weren't random. 5 vertical lines intersected by 2 horizontal, forming a deliberate glyph. Below it, 3 circles arranged in a triangle, and below that, something that made her skin prickle despite herself. A handprint. Human-sized, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers too long, the palm too narrow. "Hendricks," she called. "You need to see this." The deputy marshal examined the carvings, his face troubled. Could be old, could be from hunting camps, maybe Native American territorial markers. 8 feet up? Sophia challenged. "And look at the edges. These are fresh. Days old, maybe a week." "So Lucas carved them?" She shook her head slowly. Lucas was looking for a summit, not leaving trail markers. And these... She pulled out her phone, snapping photos. "These aren't any Native American symbols I recognize from the regional guides. I'll need to consult with the Kino Nation, but they felt wrong. They felt old in a way that had nothing to do with chronology and everything to do with something her rational mind refused to classify. The helicopter couldn't fly in the weather. 2 more teams arrived on foot by 1700 hours, expanding the search grid. But as darkness fell and they established a base camp near Lucas's abandoned tent, Sophia couldn't shake the image of those symbols from her mind. She sat in the command tent scrolling through her phone's photo library, comparing the glyphs to every database she could access on the spotty satellite internet connection. Nothing matched. She tried searching for Pacific Northwest indigenous symbols, Quinault tribal markers, Hoh River petroglyphs. Nothing. Finally, almost by accident, she found something. An academic paper from 1923, archived by the University of Washington. Forbidden Practices Among the Quinault Shamans, an anthropological survey by Dr. Marcus Thorne. The paper was dense, written in the archaic language of early anthropology, full of problematic assumptions about primitive peoples. But buried in the text was a description that made Sophia's breath catch. The most disturbing practice I encountered was the Wendigo Kwe, or hunger summoning. Certain shamans, outcasts from their own people, were said to perform rituals in the deep forest to invoke a spirit of insatiable consumption. The Quinault believed this spirit, borrowed and corrupted from Algonquian tradition via trade routes, could grant power but at terrible cost. The shaman would mark trees with specific symbols, creating a walking path for the spirit. Those who entered the marked territory were said to hear the voice of the hunger, calling them to transformation. The Quinault word for these marked trees was Kawaigapus, the posts where hunger dwells. Sophia read the passage 3 times. Folklore, superstition. Interesting from an anthropological perspective, but irrelevant to finding Lucas Brennan. And yet, she looked at the photos of the symbols again, the vertical lines, the circles, the wrong proportioned handprint. Her radio crackled. "All teams, this is base. We have a situation. Team 3 has found something. All available personnel to Sector 9 immediately." Sophia grabbed her pack and headlamp, joining the stream of searchers moving through the darkness. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the forest was a maze of shadows and reflected light. Her analytical mind tried to maintain focus. Watch your footing, maintain group cohesion, conserve your light. But underneath, something primitive was waking up. Team 3 had set up portable floods when Sophia arrived. The harsh white light made the scene even more surreal. Lucas's pack lay split open on the ground, its contents scattered, but not scattered by a fall or an animal. Scattered deliberately, in a pattern. his water bottles arranged in a triangle, his tent stakes driven into the ground in a circle, his first aid kit opened, the contents sorted by color in neat lines, and in the center of it all, carved into the soft earth, more symbols. The same glyphs from the tree, but larger, more elaborate. And around them, burned into the ground as though by acid, a perfect circle of dead moss and blackened soil. "What the hell is this?" Hendricks breathed. Sophia knelt at the edge of the circle, careful not to disturb anything. Her hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline, she told herself, just adrenaline, as she took more photos. The arrangement was too precise to be accidental, but it was also too bizarre to be the work of a rational mind. Could he be having some kind of psychological break? One of the other searchers suggested. Hypothermia can cause confusion, irrational behavior. "This isn't confusion," Sophia said quietly. "This is ritual." The word hung in the air. No one wanted to acknowledge what it implied, and then she saw the blood. Just a few drops at first, almost invisible in the dark soil. But when she shined her headlamp at the right angle, she saw the trail leading away from the circle, heading deeper into the forest. Not the bright red of fresh blood, but something darker, almost black. "We follow it," she said, standing. "Now." "Sophia, it's past 2,000 hours, Hendricks protested. "We should wait for daylight. If Lucas is injured and bleeding, we don't have until daylight." She started walking before anyone could argue. Behind her, she heard the team scrambling to follow, their voices edged with uncertainty. Good. Let them be uncertain. Uncertainty kept you alert. The blood trail led them off any established path, into old-growth forest so thick the helicopter would never spot them from above. Sophia's headlamp beam caught massive tree trunks, some 15 feet in diameter, their bark hanging in shaggy strips. Nurse logs taller than she was, covered in ferns and seedlings. The forest floor was a maze of roots and fallen wood, each step requiring careful placement. And on every 10th or 15th tree, the symbols. They were everywhere now, carved at different heights, different sizes, forming a trail deeper than the blood. Sophia found herself following them more than the scattered dark drops on the ground. Her rational mind screamed at her to stop, to turn back, to call this off until proper forensic teams could document the scene. But something else drove her forward. She needed to understand. They'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when Chris behind her suddenly stopped. "Do you hear that?" Sophia held up her hand, and the team fell silent. At first, she heard nothing but the drip of water from branches, the distant rush of the river. Then beneath it, something else. A sound that didn't belong in the forest. A sound that didn't belong anywhere. Clicking, like teeth chattering, but too fast, too rhythmic. And underneath it, a whisper that might have been the wind through branches, but might have been something forming words in a language she didn't know. "We should go back," Hendricks said, his voice tight. Sophia aimed her headlamp toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rain-slick bark, hanging moss, shadows that seemed too deep, and the figure was 40 feet away, standing motionless between two massive spruces. For a moment, Sophia's mind tried to categorize it as Lucas. It was roughly human-shaped, roughly human-sized, but as her analytical training kicked in, noting details, recording observations, she realized nothing about it was human at all. It was too thin, impossibly thin, as though someone had taken a human skeleton and stretched it upward, the limbs extending into something arachnid. The skin, if it was skin, was gray-white in her headlamp beam, pulled taut over pronounced bones. But it was the head that made her breath stop. The skull was elongated, the jaw distended and hinged too far back like a snake's, and inside that mouth rows of teeth caught the light. Not human teeth, not animal teeth. Something in between, needle-sharp and numerous. The clicking sound came from those teeth, snapping together in rapid sequence. Every rational thought in Sophia's mind screamed that this couldn't be real, couldn't exist. Her training in search and rescue had exposed her to bears, cougars, even the occasional delusional lost hiker. But this, the thing's head swiveled toward them with a sound like grinding bone, and then it moved. Not walked, moved. It covered the distance between them impossibly fast, flowing through the undergrowth like water, its elongated limbs bending at angles that violated human anatomy. Sophia's body reacted before her mind could process, diving sideways as the thing lunged past her position. Chaos erupted. Headlamps swung wildly, illuminating fragments. A clawed hand reaching, Hendricks falling backward, someone screaming. Sophia rolled, her analytical mind somehow still cataloging details even in pure panic. The thing's feet, if they were feet, left no prints in the soft earth. Its movements were soundless except for the clicking, always clicking. A gunshot split the air. Hendricks had drawn his service weapon. The shot went wild, but it was enough to make the creature freeze. It stood perfectly still for a heartbeat, then its head tilted at an angle no human neck could achieve. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, like wind through a collapsed building. Notawi, kawi. The words meant nothing to Sophia, but the tone was unmistakable. Hunger, need, yearning. And then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness so completely it might never have existed. The team stood frozen, breathing hard, hands trembling. Sophia's headlamp had been knocked sideways in her dive, casting light at a crazy angle. She reached up to adjust it, and her hand came away wet. Blood. Not hers. She wasn't injured, but when she looked down, she saw dark streaks on her jacket sleeve, her pants. Lucas's blood. They'd been following Lucas's blood, and now it was on her. What the fuck was that? Chris's voice was high, cracking. I don't know, Sophia heard herself say. But she did know. Not the specifics, not the taxonomy or classification, but she knew what she'd seen in those elongated limbs, that distended jaw, those too many teeth. Wendigo. The word from Dr. Thorne's paper surfaced in her mind. The hunger that walks. The spirit of insatiable consumption. We're leaving, Hendricks announced, his gun still drawn. Now, back to base camp. We'll call this in, get proper authorities. No. Sophia's voice surprised her with its calmness. We're close. Lucas might still be alive. Sophia, that thing left us alive, she interrupted. Why? If it wanted to kill us, we'd be dead. It's playing with us. Or, she paused, her analyst mind working through scenarios even as her hands continued to shake. Or it's leading us somewhere. She started walking before anyone could stop her, following the blood trail, following the symbols, following the clicking sound that still echoed from somewhere ahead. Behind her, she heard the team arguing, heard Hendricks cursing, but eventually they followed. They had to. You didn't leave your teammate alone in the dark. The trees opened into a clearing, unnatural, Sophia thought, too perfectly circular to be natural. And in the center of the clearing stood something that made her analytical mind finally, completely fracture. It was a structure, but calling it that felt inadequate. Bones, animal bones, she prayed, only animal bones, had been woven together with sinew and moss to create a framework, perhaps 10 feet tall. Hanging from it were offerings, strips of hide, feathers, what looked like human clothing torn into ribbons. And carved into every surface, burned into every support beam, were the symbols. Hundreds of them, overlapping and interweaving into a pattern that hurt to look at. This was the Kaweapus, the post where hunger dwells. And tied to the structure, still alive but barely conscious, was Lucas Brennan. His face was gaunt, his lips cracked and bleeding. But it was his eyes that made Sophia's stomach turn. They were open, staring but seeing nothing. Or perhaps seeing too much. When Hendricks shouted his name, Lucas didn't react. Get him down, Sophia ordered. But even as she said it, she knew something was wrong. Lucas wasn't tied with rope. His wrists and ankles were bound with strips of what looked like bark. But beneath the bark, his skin had begun to grow around it, incorporating it into his flesh. Notawi, kawi. The voice came from Lucas's mouth, but it wasn't his voice. It was the clicking voice, the everywhere nowhere voice. Chris reached for Lucas, and Sophia grabbed his arm. "Wait. Don't touch him. He's alive, we have to." Lucas's head turned toward them, and his jaw began to distend. The transformation happened slowly enough that Sophia's mind recorded every detail, fast enough that no one could stop it. Lucas's jaw unhinged, continuing to open until it gaped wide as his ribcage. His teeth began to fall out, clattering to the ground, replaced by rows of needles pushing through bleeding gums. His limbs spasmed, bones cracking audibly as they elongated, joints reversing. "Oh, God," Hendricks breathed. "Oh, Jesus Christ." The clicking filled the clearing, coming from Lucas, from the forest, from the bones of the structure itself. And Sophia understood. This wasn't an attack. This was conversion. The hunger didn't kill, it transformed. It made you into itself, an extension of its eternal, impossible need. She had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision. Stay and try to help Lucas, knowing he was already gone, or run and possibly survive. Her rational mind, the part that had guided her through 6 years of search and rescue, that had saved lives through pure analytical thinking, chose survival. "Run," she said quietly. No one moved. "Run!" she screamed. They ran. The forest became a nightmare labyrinth, their headlamp beams cutting chaotic arcs through the darkness. Behind them, the clicking multiplied, became a chorus. Not just one Wendigo now, but many. Or perhaps just one that existed in multiple places simultaneously. Sophia's scientific training tried and failed to categorize what was hunting them. Chris went down first, his scream cutting off mid-breath. Sophia didn't look back. Couldn't look back. A volunteer named Sarah stumbled and something pale flashed in Sophia's peripheral vision. And then Sarah was gone too, dragged sideways into the undergrowth without even time to cry out. Hendricks was shouting into his radio, calling for evacuation, for backup, for anything. But the only response was static. They were too deep, too far from any relay. Sophia's analyst mind, the part that refused to fully shatter even now, noted that they were being herded. Every time they tried to turn toward camp, one of the things would appear ahead of them, driving them deeper. Toward what, she didn't know. Didn't want to know. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she kept running because the alternative was becoming like Lucas, was feeling her jaw distend and her hunger become eternal, and Hendricks fell behind. She heard his gun fire once, twice, then silence. And then it was just her, alone in the ancient forest, being chased by hunger given form. She burst out of the tree line onto the bank of the Ho River. The water roared past, swollen with rain, impassable. Behind her, the clicking grew closer. Sophia spun, her back to the water, her headlamp illuminating the tree line. They emerged in a line, 5 figures, each one a variation on the same impossible anatomy. Lucas, or what had been Lucas, stood in the center. His transformation was nearly complete now, his humanity just a suggestion in the tilt of his elongated skull. "Kaway, Kaway." They clicked in unison. Hunger. Hunger. Sophia's hand found the knife on her belt, a tool for cutting climbing rope and opening packages. Against what stood before her, it was meaningless. But she held it anyway, because holding it meant she was still human, still rational, still Sophia Chen, and not. The things moved closer. And then, from behind them, a voice. Human. Old. Speaking in a language Sophia didn't understand but somehow comprehended in the part of her brain that remembered older things than rationality. An old man stepped out of the forest. He was Kino, Sophia thought, or some other indigenous nation of the region. He wore traditional regalia, woven cedar bark cape, painted designs on his face, and carried a staff carved with symbols that made Sophia's eyes water to look at directly. He spoke again, and the Wendigos hesitated. Lucas's head cocked at that inhuman angle, teeth clicking uncertainly. The old man raised his staff and slammed it into the ground. The impact was soundless, but Sophia felt it in her chest, in her bones. The Wendigos recoiled as one, shrinking back toward the tree line. "Kappa hui," the old man commanded. "Go back." They went. Not vanishing, but withdrawing, step by step, clicking their disappointment until the forest swallowed them completely. The old man turned to Sophia. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, but his gaze was sharp. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "You have been marked," he said simply. Sophia looked down at her hands. The blood on her sleeve had dried dark, but beneath it, she saw patterns in her skin. Not carved, but growing from within, the symbols rising through her epidermis like tattoos forming in reverse. "What's happening to me?" Her voice shook. "The hunger knows you now, knows your scent, your name, your heart. You entered the Kewezapus. You followed the path, He paused, searching for words. "You tasted it, and it tasted you." "I didn't. I was just trying to find. Intentions do not matter in the old places. Only actions, only choices." He stepped closer, examining her face. "But you did not feed. That is important. You ran instead of consuming. There is still time." "Time for what?" "To choose. The hunger will call to you now always. In your sleep, in your waking, it will show you how easy it would be to take, to consume, to never be empty again. Most who are marked eventually answer." Sophia felt her knees weakening, felt herself beginning to shake not from cold, but from the full weight of understanding. "And if I don't answer?" The old man's expression was sad. "Then you fight, every day, every hour, until you die or the hunger does." "Can it die?" "No. But it can be kept sleeping if enough people remember the old warnings, if enough people respect the boundaries." He gestured at the forest behind them. "This is why my grandfather taught me, why his grandfather taught him, why we maintain the vigil even though our own people have forgotten. Because things like that—" He nodded toward where the Wendigos had vanished. "Do not end. They only wait." Sophia looked at her hands again. The symbols were clearer now, crawling up her wrists like living things. What do I tell them? The authorities? The families? Tell them Lucas Brennan violated sacred ground. Tell them he went mad from hypothermia and is presumed dead. Tell them whatever lets you sleep. The old man turned to go, then paused. Or tell them the truth and watch them call you mad instead. The choice is yours. But know this. You cannot lead them back to the Kewezapus, cannot show them the path. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed by force, only by forgetting. But people need to know, need to be warned. They were warned. For 10,000 years they were warned. And still, people like your Lucas walk into the old places thinking they are empty. He met her eyes one final time. The forest is never empty, Sophia Chen. It is only waiting to be full. Then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness as completely as the Wendigos had, leaving Sophia alone by the rushing river. She stood there until dawn began to gray the sky, until she heard the sounds of helicopters in the distance, until her radio crackled with voices calling her name. When she finally turned toward civilization, her hands had stopped shaking. The symbols on her skin had faded to faint lines visible only at certain angles, but she could still hear it, underneath everything. The clicking, the whisper. Kwe, Kwe, hunger, hunger. The official report listed Lucas Brennan as missing, presumed dead due to exposure and hypothermia. 3 SAR personnel, Chris Martinez, Sarah Kim, and Deputy Marshal Tom Hendricks, were listed as lost in the line of duty, their bodies never recovered. The search area was eventually closed due to dangerous conditions. Sophia Chen received commendations for her efforts. She continued working in search and rescue for another 6 months before quietly resigning. Some nights, She could almost convince herself it had been a shared delusion, a mass hallucination brought on by stress and bad conditions. But other nights, when she looked at her hands in the dark and saw the symbols glowing faintly beneath her skin, when she felt the gnawing emptiness that no amount of eating could fill, when she heard the clicking in her dreams calling her back to the forest, those nights, she knew better. The hunger was patient. The hunger was eternal. And the hunger knew her name. She would fight it for as long as she could. But deep down, in the part of herself that had seen Lucas's transformation, that had felt the ancient wrongness of the Quasapus, she knew the truth. Everyone who was marked eventually answered the call. It was only a matter of time. The forest was waiting, and it was always hungry. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The rain hadn't stopped for 6 hours, and neither had Christopher Hayes. His boots squelched through moss that seemed to grow thicker with each mile, the kind of moss that swallowed sound and made the Olympic forest feel like it existed outside of time. Chris paused at marker 7.3, checking his handheld GPS against the waterproof map. The screen flickered, typical for this deep in the Hoh rainforest section, but it confirmed what he already knew. Sofia Martinez had last checked in somewhere between mile 8 and 9 of the Enchanted Valley Trail, before her satellite phone went dead. That was 11 hours ago. Chris pressed the transmit button on his radio. Ranger Hayes to base. I'm at the 7.3 marker, still no sign of the missing hiker. Static crackled, then Tom's voice came through, distorted by the canopy. Copy that, Chris. How's visibility? Maybe 40 feet. The fog's thicker than yesterday's soup. Chris released the button, listening to the forest's silence. That was the thing people never understood about the rainforest. It wasn't quiet like a desert or a snowfield. It was quiet like a held breath, like something waiting. He'd felt it since dawn. That prickling awareness at the base of his skull. The one that had served him well over 14 years as a ranger. The one his ex-wife had called his spooky bullshit before she left. Chris didn't call it anything. He just knew when something in the woods was wrong, the way other people knew when a storm was coming. Right now, every instinct he had was screaming. Chris, you still there? He keyed the radio again. Yeah, Tom, just thinking. The Martinez family, they still at the ranger station? Her parents? Yeah, they haven't moved. Her mother's been praying in Spanish for the last 4 hours. Her father keeps asking if we've called in search and rescue from Seattle. Chris wiped rain from his face. The water here didn't fall. It manifested, condensing out of the air itself until everything existed in varying states of wetness. His jacket, supposedly waterproof, had given up the pretense around hour 3. Tell them I'm going to find her, Chris said, and immediately felt foolish. Empty promises helped no one. Will do. Be careful out there. Weather service says the temperature's dropping fast. She's got maybe 8 hours before hypothermia becomes critical, if she's injured and immobile. Chris signed off and kept moving. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by Sitka spruce and western hemlock that towered 300 feet overhead. Some of these trees had been seedlings when Columbus was still trying to convince people the earth was round. Their roots formed walls along the trail, twisted shapes that looked almost deliberate in the fog, almost like hands. He stopped. There, 20 yards ahead, just visible through the mist. A splash of color that didn't belong. Chris approached slowly, that feeling at the base of his skull intensifying. It was a backpack. Blue and orange, the cheap kind sold at outdoor outlet stores. Chris knelt beside it, noting how it sat perfectly upright against a nurse log, as if someone had carefully placed it there rather than dropped it in panic. Sophia? His voice felt too loud, too intrusive. Sofia Martinez? The forest absorbed his words. Chris unzipped the pack with gloved hands, finding exactly what he expected. Water bottles, energy bars, a field guide to Pacific Northwest flora, notebooks filled with neat handwriting about moss samples and fungal growth, and a student ID, Sofia Martinez, University of Washington, Department of Biology. Her photo showed a young woman with dark eyes and an eager smile, the kind of smile that said she believed the world made sense and followed rules. He pressed his radio. "Tom, I found her pack. Marker 7.8 just off the main trail on the north side. Everything's still in it. Water, food, ID. It's been placed, not dropped." "Placed?" "Yeah, like she set it down carefully and walked away." The static stretched longer than usual. "That doesn't make sense. Why would she leave her supplies?" "I don't know." Chris straightened up, scanning the surrounding forest. "But I'm going to follow her trail from here. There are some impressions in the moss heading northwest." "Northwest? Chris, that's off trail. That's towards the radio cut out." Chris tapped it, checked the battery. Full power. He repositioned the antenna, tried again. Nothing but white noise, like the signal had been swallowed. That prickling sensation spread from his skull down his spine. He should wait. Protocol said to mark the location, radio for backup, establish a search grid. But that same instinct that had served him for 14 years said that following protocol would mean finding a body instead of a person. Chris marked the backpack's location with orange tape, took a GPS reading, though the device was still glitching, and pushed into the undergrowth. The impressions in the moss were subtle but readable to someone who'd spent years tracking lost hikers. Boot prints, women's size 7 or 8, moving deliberately but not frantically. No signs of stumbling or disorientation. She'd walked into the forest like she knew where she was going. The fog thickened. Chris pulled out his flashlight even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. The canopy and clouds conspired to create a perpetual twilight. His beam caught droplets suspended in the air, creating walls of diffused light that somehow made visibility worse. After 10 minutes, he found the first concerning sign. A circle of mushrooms, perfect, geometrically exact, each fungal body the same height and spacing. Chris had seen fairy rings before. They were common in old-growth forests, but never one this precise. The mushrooms were pale, almost luminescent in the gloom, and as he approached, he could have sworn they leaned away from him. He shook his head. Trees didn't move. Mushrooms didn't flinch. He was tired, had been hiking for hours, was seeing patterns where none existed. But the feeling wouldn't leave. He circled the ring, about 15 feet in diameter, and found Sophia's trail continuing on the far side. She'd walked straight through it. Chris hesitated, then followed, stepping carefully over the fungal border. The temperature dropped. Not gradually, like when a cloud covers the sun, but instantly, like walking through a wall of ice water. Chris's breath misted in front of him. His fingers, already numb from rain, began to ache with genuine cold. He checked his thermometer, 48 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 minutes ago at the backpack it had been 56, 8 degrees and 15 feet. That was impossible. "Sophia!" His voice echoed strangely, bouncing back with an odd delay. "Sophia Martinez! If you can hear me, call out!" Silence. Then, "Help." The word came from ahead and to the left, thin and desperate. A young woman's voice. Chris ran. The forest became a blur of green and brown, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. Roots tried to catch his boots. Branches grabbed at his jacket. The undergrowth was denser here, hostile as if the forest itself was trying to slow him down. "I'm coming," he shouted. "Keep talking so I can find you. Help me." The voice was closer now. "Please, I'm scared." Chris burst into a small clearing, flashlight sweeping the area. Empty. Just more moss, more trees, more fog. The voice had come from here. He was certain, but there was no one. "Sophia, I'm here," she said, and this time the voice came from behind him. Chris spun. Nothing. The clearing was empty except for him and his rapidly accelerating pulse. "Where are you?" He turned in a slow circle, flashlight probing every shadow. "I can't see you." "Can't you?" The voice moved again, circling him. "You've always been good at seeing, Christopher. Better than most. That's why we chose you." His heart hammered against his ribs. "Who is we?" Sophia, are you hurt? Are you confused? Laughter, soft and wrong, coming from every direction at once. Do you think I'm Sophia, Christopher? Do you really? He ran. Didn't know which direction, didn't care, just needed to move to get away from that voice that wore a young woman's fear like a mask. His boots pounded against the forest floor. His breath came in gasps. The fog seemed to chase him, reaching with tendrils that weren't quite physical but weren't quite his imagination either. Chris broke out of the undergrowth onto a game trail, not the main hiking path, but something animals used. He stopped, hands on knees, trying to catch his breath and slow his thundering heart. He was a rational man. 14 years as a ranger, degree in forestry, Eagle Scout since he was 16. There were explanations for everything. The voice was an auditory hallucination caused by exhaustion and stress. The cold was a microclimate. The mushroom ring was a coincidence, the fog playing tricks on his eyes. But that feeling at the base of his skull said he was lying to himself. His radio crackled to life. Chris, can you... Tom. Chris grabbed the radio. Tom, something's wrong out here. I need backup at... Isn't safe, Chris. You need to... Static swallowed the words. Coming back. Don't what? Tom, I can't hear you. Repeat your last. Don't trust what you see, the radio said in Tom's voice. Then, without any change in tone or inflection, don't trust what you hear. Don't trust what you remember. It's already inside you, Christopher. It's been inside since you crossed the threshold. Chris dropped the radio. It landed in the moss and went silent. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Christopher's situation? Share your thoughts. He backed away from the radio like it was a snake. His mind raced through possibilities. Someone was pranking him. The radio frequency had crossed with another conversation. He'd finally cracked under the stress of too many lost hikers and not enough saves. None of those explanations felt true. Chris pulled out his backup flashlight. Always carry redundancy, that was Wilderness 101, and checked his compass. The needle spun lazily, never quite settling on magnetic north. He tapped it. The needle continued its slow rotation. Okay. No radio, no compass, GPS unreliable. And he was somewhere off-trail in the Olympic National Park with a missing hiker, and apparently his own deteriorating grip on reality. Time to go back to basics. Chris looked up, trying to spot the sun through the canopy and clouds. The light was diffuse, sourceless, offering no directional clues. He checked the moss on the trees. It grew on the north side, but here, in the rainforest, moss grew on every side. He knelt and examined the ground, looking for slope, for water flow patterns, for anything that would tell him which way was downhill. Everything looked the same. Flat, green, eternal. You're lost, he said out loud, needing to hear something real, even if it was just his own voice acknowledging a truth. You're lost, and you need to think. Everyone's lost, Sophia's voice answered from the trees. Some people just haven't realized it yet. Chris forced himself not to run. He turned slowly, flashlight raised like a weapon, and saw her. Sophia Martinez stood at the edge of the clearing, exactly as she appeared in her student ID photo. Blue jacket, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, that eager smile. Except her clothes were dry. Perfectly dry, despite the fact that it had been raining for 6 hours and every living thing in this forest dripped with moisture. You're not real, Chris said. Are you sure? She tilted her head. The movement was wrong somehow, too fluid, like a puppet being manipulated by an expert hand. You're looking at me, seeing me. How can I be more real? Because real people get wet in the rain. Sophia, or the thing wearing her shape, looked down at herself, seeming to notice the dryness for the first time. When she looked back up, water suddenly streamed from her hair, her clothes dripping onto the moss. Better? Chris's throat went dry. He'd seen hallucinations before, knew how they worked. They didn't respond to logic. They didn't correct themselves based on observation. What are you? He whispered. What do you think I am? She stepped closer. You've felt me since you entered the forest, Christopher. That feeling at the base of your skull, that knowing. I've been whispering to you for hours, and you've been listening. No. He shook his head. No. I've been searching for a missing person. I've been doing my job. Have you? Another step. She was 20 feet away now. Or have you been walking exactly where I wanted you to walk? Following the trail I laid out? You found the backpack where I placed it? You crossed the threshold where I opened it. You've been mine since you stepped through the fairy ring. The fairy ring. The mushrooms. The sudden cold. Chris remembered stories from the Kino people. Tales passed down about the deep forest, about places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. His grandfather, half Kino himself, had warned him about certain trails, certain trees that stood as markers. "You're not real," he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "Neither are you anymore." Sophia's face split into a smile too wide for human anatomy. "Not entirely. Part of you is already changing. Haven't you noticed? The way sounds echo differently, the way time feels strange, the way you can see things in the fog that weren't there before." She was right. God help him, she was right. Chris could see shapes moving in the mist now, forms that flickered at the edge of perception, and the sounds. He could hear layers to the forest that hadn't been there before. Whispers underneath the rain, breathing beneath the wind. The real Sophia Martinez. He forced the words out. "Where is she?" The thing wearing her face laughed. "Oh, she's here. She's been here the whole time. Just like you're here. Just like everyone who crosses certain thresholds becomes here. The forest keeps what it's given. I want to see her. The real her." "Do you? Are you sure?" The smile faded. "Once you see, Christopher, you can't unsee. Once you know, you can't unknow. Isn't it better to stay uncertain, to walk back out of the forest, file your report, tell the family you did your best? You could do that. I'd let you. You're not the one I wanted anyway. Show me." "Sophia," the thing sighed. "Your choice." She gestured to the left. The fog pulled back like a curtain. At first, Chris couldn't process what he was seeing. His brain refused to accept the input, tried to reject it as impossible. But as he stared, the pieces assembled into terrible understanding. Trees. Dozens of them, scattered through the clearing. But their bark was wrong. Too smooth, too pale. As his flashlight beam touched them, he saw why. They weren't bark at all. Faces. Human faces absorbed into the wood, mouths open in eternal silence. Some were fresh enough that he could still see details. The texture of their skin, the color of their eyes. Others had been here longer, features smoothing into the grain of the wood, becoming part of the tree's pattern. And there, on a young hemlock no more than 20 years grown, was Sophia Martinez. Her eyes were open but unseeing, her mouth shaped around a word she'd never finished speaking. Roots grew through her, around her, from her, anchoring her to the earth and sky. Chris's legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the moss, unable to look away. Because it wasn't just Sophia. He recognized others, faces from missing person reports, cases that had gone cold, hikers who'd vanished over the years along this trail. All of them here. All of them feeding the forest. "This is the Enchanted Valley," the thing wearing Sophia said softly. "This is where life pays its debt to the wood. These trees will stand for 300 years, maybe more, and everyone who gave them root will be part of that growth, that reaching toward light. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that better than dying in some hospital, rotting in some box?" "You're insane," Chris managed. "No, I'm patient. I'm old. I've been here since before your people named these mountains, since before anyone tried to map what shouldn't be mapped. Contain what shouldn't be contained." The thing crouched beside him, and up close, Chris could see how its edges flickered, how its substance wasn't quite solid. "I feed on the boundary between life and death, on the moment of transition. Your fear makes that moment sweeter, longer. So I let you wander, let you hope, let you think you might succeed. And then I show you the truth. Chris's hand closed around something in his pocket. His emergency beacon, the kind that sent a satellite distress signal to search and rescue. He'd forgotten about it. Or had something made him forget? You can't leave, the thing said, reading his thoughts. You crossed the threshold. The rules are different now. Maybe. Chris pulled out the beacon, flipped open the protective cap. But I'm not dead yet. He triggered the beacon. For a moment, nothing happened. Then light, pure white electronic light, flooded the clearing. The thing wearing Sophia's face screamed, a sound that had nothing to do with human vocal cords. The fog recoiled. The shapes in the mist dissolved. And Chris ran. He didn't know if the beacon would bring help or if it even worked in this place, but the light had bought him seconds, and he intended to use them. His flashlight beam cut through darkness that seemed actively hostile now, revealing paths that twisted back on themselves, roots that rose up to trip him, branches that clawed at his face. Behind him, the thing's scream modulated into words. You can't escape. You're already changing. Part of you belongs here now. Maybe it was right. Chris could feel something wrong inside him, something that had hooked into his mind during those hours of searching. Thoughts that weren't quite his own, impulses to stop, to rest, to join the others in their wooden sleep. But he'd spent 14 years learning how to survive in wilderness, and the first rule was simple. Keep moving. Your legs might be exhausted, your mind might be giving up, but if you kept moving, you had a chance. The forest fought him. What had taken him 40 minutes to hike in seemed to take hours to escape. Time moved strangely, stretching and compressing. He'd check his watch and find that 5 minutes had passed in what felt like seconds, or that an eternity had compressed into a single moment. But eventually, though he couldn't say how long it took, Chris saw something that didn't belong to the ancient forest. Orange survey tape. His marker, left at Sophia's backpack. He was back on the trail. The fog was lighter here, the temperature warmer. Chris could hear his radio crackling with normal static, could see his compass needle pointing steady north. His GPS flickered back to life, showing his position clearly. He'd crossed back. Chris staggered forward, legs shaking, and found his way to the main trail. The rain had stopped. Afternoon sun broke through the clouds, creating shafts of golden light through the canopy. It was beautiful, normal, real. His radio crackled. Chris? Christopher Hayes, do you copy? Tom. His voice was hoarse. Tom, I'm here. I'm on the main trail at marker 7.8. Thank God. We got your emergency beacon. Search and rescue is en route, ETA 20 minutes. Are you injured? No, Chris looked back the way he'd come. The forest was just forest again, green and ancient and innocent. I found where Sophia Martinez went. Is she alive? Chris thought about the face in the tree, the eyes that would never close, the mouth shaped around an unfinished word. He thought about telling the truth, about explaining what he'd seen. They'd never believe him. They'd think he'd cracked, lost his mind in the woods, became another casualty of stress and isolation. But her parents were waiting at the ranger station. They deserved something. No, he said finally. She's not alive, but I know where she is. I'll need to take a team back in tomorrow in daylight with more people. Copy that. Just stay where you are. Help is coming. Chris sat down on a moss-covered log and waited. His hands were shaking. That feeling at the base of his skull, the knowing, the sensing, hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. He could feel the forest watching him, patient and eternal, knowing what he knew. Part of him hadn't made it out. Part of him would always be standing in that clearing, staring at faces in trees, listening to something ancient whisper, promises about beauty and belonging and release from the exhausting work of being human. When the rescue team arrived, they found Christopher Hayes sitting in the last of the afternoon light, staring into the forest with eyes that had seen too much. They called him a hero for triggering his beacon, for making it out alive, for giving the Martinez family at least the closure of knowing. But Chris knew the truth. The thing in the forest had let him go, not out of mercy or defeat, but because it knew what he'd become. A vector, a carrier, someone who'd crossed the threshold and brought part of that other place back with him. That night, in the ranger station, he wrote his report. Told the story of finding Sophia's backpack, of following her trail off-path, of discovering what he carefully described as a ravine concealed by undergrowth where it appears the victim fell and sustained fatal injuries. It was believable. It was rational. It closed the case. And every word was a lie. Chris added one final note, marked it private, locked it in his desk. Don't assign anyone to the Enchanted Valley Trail section. Don't let anyone hike it alone. And if someone goes missing there, don't send me to find them. Because I'll hear them calling. I'll hear them even when they're not making any sound. And eventually, I won't be able to tell the difference between their voices and the one that's been whispering in my head since I crossed back. Part of me is still there. Part of me will always be there. And someday, when the whispers get too loud, the rest of me will follow. He locked the note away and went home, where he wouldn't sleep, where he'd lie in bed and feel the boundary between here and there growing thinner, where he'd wonder if he'd really escaped at all, or if escape had only ever been another kind of trap. The forest was patient. It had been patient for centuries. It could wait a little longer. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation about what really happened to Christopher in that forest? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The phone rang for the third time in 6 hours, and Carter Reeves knew, the way a body knows to flinch before conscious thought catches up, that this call would pull him back into the forest he'd been avoiding for 8 years. Olympic National Park, Ranger Station 7. His voice came out steady, practiced, professional. Please. The word broke apart in the woman's throat. Please, my daughter. Harper Caldwell. She went hiking this morning on the Hoh River Trail. Just a day hike. She had her phone, she had water, she knows how to be safe. Carter's pen hovered over the incident report form, the same form he'd filled out 247 times in his career. 246 had ended with people found, cold, scared, sheepish, but alive. The 247th had ended with him in a psychiatric evaluation for 3 months. Ma'am, I need you to take a breath for me. When did Harper last make contact? 10:47 this morning, a text message. Papers rustled on the other end. The mother was reading from something, trying to hold herself together with facts. But it was strange. She sent it to her own number. It said, "You're hearing me, right? Please respond." I thought maybe she meant to send it to me, but when I called her, it went straight to voicemail and Carter's pen had stopped moving entirely. The fluorescent lights in the station hummed their perpetual note, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in the part that remembered things he'd spent 8 years trying to forget, something whispered, "Not again. Not like before." "I'm dispatching search and rescue immediately," he said, already standing, already reaching for his pack. What was Harper wearing? 20 minutes later, Carter stood at the Hoh River trailhead, watching the late afternoon light filter through the canopy in that peculiar way it only did in temperate rainforests, greenish, aquatic, like being at the bottom of an ocean made of air. The Hoh rainforest received 140 inches of rainfall per year, and every surface proved it. Moss hung from big leaf maples in curtains thick enough to hide a person. Sitka spruce rose 200 feet overhead, their trunks wrapped in gardens of ferns and lichens. His radio crackled. "Station 7, this is Unit 3. We're staging at the 5-mile marker. What's your 20? Starting from the trailhead. Harper's vehicle is still in the lot. A silver Honda Civic, Washington plates." Carter touched the hood. Cold. "She's been out there at least 7 hours. Copy that. Weather's moving in around 1900 hours. We've got maybe 3 hours of decent visibility." Carter clicked off the radio and stood there. Pack settled on his shoulders, the weight of it familiar as his own bones. In his chest pocket, his phone buzzed. Harper's mother again, probably. He couldn't answer. Not yet. Not until he had something to tell her that wasn't just professional platitudes about search patterns and probability matrices. The trail began innocently enough, well-maintained and clearly marked, winding along the crystalline Ho River. Carter moved quickly, his eyes scanning automatically. Broken branches at shoulder height, disturbed moss, footprints in the perpetually damp earth. A family of 4 passed him heading back to the trailhead, their youngest daughter skipping ahead. "Excuse me," Carter called. "Did you see a young woman on the trail? 19 years old, blonde hair, blue backpack?" The father paused, considering. "Yeah, actually. Maybe around 1 wow. She was sitting by the river at the 3-mile marker, just sitting there, staring at the water. Was she alone? Far as I could tell." The father's expression shifted, became uncertain. Though she was talking to someone, or, I don't know, I thought I heard 2 voices. But when we got closer, it was just her. Something in Carter's stomach turned over, cold and heavy. "Thank you." He pushed faster. At the 3-mile marker, he found the spot. A flat section of riverbank where generations of hikers had worn the earth smooth. Harper's boot prints were clear in the mud, along with something else. Carter crouched, studying the impressions. Her prints approached the water's edge, then nothing. They didn't retreat back to the trail. They simply stopped, as if she'd been lifted straight up into the air. Except there, barely visible in the moss beside her last footprint, was another set of marks. Barefoot. Human-sized, but the toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. And they led deeper into the forest, away from the marked trail, toward the densest part of the rainforest where sunlight hadn't touched the ground in 1,000 years. Carter's radio was in his hand before he made the conscious decision to call it in. "Unit 3, I've got tracks leading off trail at mile 3 heading northwest into the interior. I'm following." "Negative, Station 7. You know protocol. Wait for backup." Protocol. He knew protocol. Protocol said don't go alone into the Olympic wilderness when daylight was failing. Protocol said trust your team, trust the system, trust that everything would be fine if you just followed the rules. Protocol had gotten Marcus killed. "Copy that," Carter said, and turned off his radio. The forest changed the moment he left the maintained trail. The temperature dropped 10 degrees and the quality of sound shifted. Not exactly silent, but muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and reluctant to carry vibrations. The moss underfoot absorbed every footfall. Within 50 yards, Carter couldn't hear the river anymore, though the map on his GPS showed he was only 100 feet from it. The tracks continued, impossibly clear despite the failing light. Barefoot impressions pressed into moss that should have bounced back within minutes. At one point, the trail led directly up the trunk of a fallen Sitka spruce, across its moss-covered surface, and down the other side. A route that would have been difficult for an experienced climber, let alone a barefoot hiker in distress. Unless she wasn't in distress. Unless she was being led. Carter's headlamp caught something bright in the undergrowth. A scrap of fabric. He knelt, pulling it free. Blue nylon, the same color as the backpack Harper's mother had described. Except the edge wasn't torn. It was cut, precisely with something very sharp. "Harper!" His voice died in the moss-thick air, barely traveling 20 feet. "Harper Caldwell, this is Park Ranger Carter Reeves. If you can hear me, make a noise, any noise." Silence. Then, from somewhere ahead and to the left, or maybe above, the acoustics were wrong in here. A voice. "Carter." He froze. The voice had been Marcus's. Marcus, who had been dead for 8 years, who had vanished on a routine patrol in the North Cascades, whose body they'd found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine with no explanation for how he'd gotten there, no sign of a fall, no defensive wounds, just dead. Eyes open, staring at nothing. "I know you're not real," Carter said to the forest. His voice shook despite his best efforts. "I know what you are." "Do you?" This time the voice came from behind him, and it was his own. Not Marcus's. His. "Because I remember you couldn't tell the difference 8 years ago. You thought you were talking to Marcus right up until they found his body. How long had he been dead while you were having conversations with something else? The thing about parasitic entities, and Carter had read everything he could find after Marcus's death, every folklore text and paranormal investigation report and psychiatric journal about auditory hallucinations, was that they learned. They fed on confusion, on uncertainty, on the small cracks in human confidence. They mimicked voices, yes, but more than that, they mimicked thoughts. They got inside and wore you like a suit. Carter's hands were shaking. He forced them steady, forced himself to breathe the way the therapist had taught him. Ground yourself in physical reality. Name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear. If this story is grabbing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Carter's situation? Trust his instincts or stick to protocol? Share your thoughts. Except when he tried to focus on what he could see, the forest had changed. The trees were closer together than they'd been a moment ago. The moss hung lower, and there, carved into the bark of a western hemlock at eye level, were words in a script he almost recognized. You brought it back with you. Harper! Carter shouted, abandoning caution. Harper, where are you? Here. The voice was young, female, terrified. Harper's voice, probably. I'm right here, why can't you see me? Keep talking. I'm following your voice. But you're walking away from me. Carter, you're walking toward the river. Stop. Stop. He did stop because Harper was right. He'd somehow gotten turned around completely. According to his GPS, he was now less than 30 feet from the Hoh River, which meant he'd walked in a massive circle. But he hadn't crossed the river. He was certain he hadn't crossed the river. Except the water in front of him was flowing the wrong direction. Upriver, against gravity. Carter's headlamp flickered, dimmed, went out entirely. He slapped it twice, the universal gesture of human frustration with technology, and it blazed back to life, brighter than before, bright enough to illuminate the figure standing on the opposite bank. It looked like Harper, blonde hair, blue backpack, 19 years old and terrified. Her mouth moved, forming words, but no sound emerged. Behind her, the forest was wrong. Too dark, too deep. Trees that hadn't existed a second ago now stretched back into infinite shadow, and between their trunks other figures moved. Dozens of them, hundreds, all wearing the faces of people Carter had known. His father, dead from cancer in 2009. His high school girlfriend alive and well in Seattle, but here she was, hollowed out, puppeted. Marcus. Always Marcus. You can't have her, Carter said. His voice came out stronger than he felt. You can't have any of them. The Harper thing on the opposite bank tilted its head, and when it smiled, its teeth were too numerous, too white, arranged in too many rows. It opened its mouth, and what came out wasn't Harper's voice at all. It was every voice, layered and harmonized and utterly inhuman. We already do. The ground beneath Carter's feet wasn't ground anymore. It was moss, but the moss was moving, breathing, pulling at his boots with the insistence of quicksand. He jerked backward, and his headlamp caught movement in the trees to his right. The real Harper, barely conscious, being dragged by something that wore her own face like a mask. Training took over. Carter didn't think. He moved, across the river, which was only ankle-deep and flowing in the correct direction now because of course it was, crashing through undergrowth, driven by the same desperate certainty that had made him keep searching for Marcus long after everyone else had given up. He reached Harper just as her doppelganger turned to face him. Up close, the mimicry was perfect. Exactly the same features, same clothes, same expression of absolute terror. For a heartbeat, Carter couldn't tell which was real. Then the real Harper, the one being dragged, whispered, "It's been pretending to be me all day. It texted my mom. It talked to those hikers. It's been wearing me." The other Harper, the thing, stopped smiling. Its face remained perfectly composed, but something behind its eyes shifted like looking at a person through water, and realizing you're actually seeing the reflection of something else entirely. "You can't take her," it said in Harper's voice. "She's already mostly gone. Look at her hands." Carter looked. Harper's hands were translucent, fading, the veins beneath her skin visible as dark tributaries. She was being consumed, unmade, fed upon by something that didn't just want her body, it wanted her existence. "How do I stop it?" Carter demanded. The Harper thing considered this. "You don't. We've been here longer than these trees, longer than the mountains. We were here before humans had language to name us, and we'll be here after. But we're not unreasonable. We'll trade." "Trade what?" "The one who got away." Its smile widened. "Marcus didn't die in the North Cascades. He's still out there, still running, still being hunted. We never got to finish with him. You interrupted us, so we've been waiting for you to come back. And here you are." The words hit Carter like a physical blow. For 8 years he'd believed Marcus was dead. For 8 years he'd carried the guilt of not reaching him in time. But if this thing was telling the truth, and why would it lie, then Marcus was still out there, still suffering, still salvageable. "You're lying," Carter said, but his voice betrayed him. He wanted it to be true. He wanted it so badly that his therapist's warnings echoed in his head. Parasitic entities feed on desire. They offer you what you want most. Then they consume you through your own hope. "Am I?" The thing wearing Harper's face took a step closer. "Call him. Right now. See if he answers." Carter's phone was in his hand before he made the conscious decision to reach for it. His fingers found Marcus's number, never deleted, never able to delete it, and pressed call. It rang. Once, twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. "Carter?" The voice was weak, distant, but unmistakably Marcus's. "Jesus Christ, Carter, is that really you? I don't know where I am. It's dark and there are things moving out here and I can hear them talking with my voice, with your voice, with..." Carter's thumb hovered over the button to end the call. Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, a manipulation, another layer of the parasitic entity's deception. But what if it wasn't? What if Marcus had been alone in the dark for 8 years, waiting for rescue that never came? Harper's real body was almost invisible now, fading like morning fog. Minutes left, maybe seconds. "Make your choice," the entity said. "The girl or your friend. Save one, lose one, or refuse, and lose both." Carter's mind raced through possibilities. There had to be a third option. There was always a third option if you could think clearly enough, act decisively enough. But the forest was pressing in, the moss was rising to his knees, and Harper's eyes were closing, and Marcus's voice on the phone was begging, "Please, please, don't leave me here again." And then Carter understood. "No," he said. The entity blinked. "No. You don't trade because you're benevolent. You trade because you need to, because you can't take without consent. That's why you manipulate, why you offer choices, why you make people complicit in their own destruction." Carter's voice grew stronger. "Marcus is dead. He's been dead for 8 years. This is just you, using his voice, trying to make me choose. But I don't choose. Then she dies." "Maybe." Carter holstered his phone and drew his knife, a bench-made bushcrafter, 7-inch blade, practical and lethal. "Or maybe I kill this body you're wearing. Maybe I destroy the anchor you're using to manifest in physical space. What happens to you then?" The entity wearing Harper's face stopped smiling entirely. "You won't. Humans don't kill what looks human. It's your greatest weakness. You're not human." Carter moved forward. "You're just borrowing the shape." He lunged. The blade struck true, cutting through what should have been flesh but felt like dense fog, like stabbing into a thundercloud. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't a sound, that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his skull. The Harper doppelganger collapsed, its form breaking apart into moths, hundreds of them, wings the color of grave dirt. The real Harper gasped, suddenly solid again, color flooding back into her skin. She looked at Carter with wild, traumatized eyes. What What was... Don't! Carter pulled her to her feet. Don't try to understand it. Just run. They ran. The forest pursued, not with footsteps but with presence, with the sense of vast attention focusing on them like a magnifying glass focusing sunlight. Trees bent toward them. Moss reached. The river appeared on their left, then their right, then somehow ahead of them, flowing in 3 directions simultaneously. Carter's GPS had stopped working. His compass spun uselessly. Every tree looked identical. Every shadow held faces. Harper was sobbing, but she kept moving because the alternative was worse than exhaustion. And then, impossibly, they were back on the trail. The marked, maintained, blessedly mundane Ho River Trail, with its interpretive signs and its boardwalks and its absolute wonderful normalcy. Behind them, the deep forest stood silent and still, revealing nothing. Harper collapsed. Carter caught her before she hit the ground, and they sat there together while his radio crackled back to life. Station 7, what's your status? We lost your signal for 40 minutes. I have Harper Caldwell, Carter said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, like he was speaking a language he'd almost forgotten. She's alive. We're on the trail at mile marker 2, requesting immediate medical evac. Copy that. Is she injured? Carter looked at Harper. Physically, she appeared unharmed. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of exposure. But her eyes were wrong. They held the same look Carter had seen in his own mirror every morning for 8 years. The look of someone who'd seen behind the curtain of reality and could never again fully believe in the stage show. No, he said. No injuries. They extracted Harper 20 minutes later. Her mother arrived with the helicopter, collapsing into grateful tears that Carter couldn't quite share, because as Harper was being loaded onto the stretcher, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "It said Marcus says thank you for finally letting him go." Carter felt the words like a knife between his ribs. He waited until the helicopter was gone, until the other rangers had packed up their gear and headed back to the station, until he was alone on the trail as the last light faded from the sky. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at his call history. There was no record of the call to Marcus's number. There was no record of any calls for the past 3 hours. But when he opened his photos, there was a new image, taken at 6:47 p.m., exactly the time he'd been in the deepest part of the forest. It showed 2 figures standing by the river. One was clearly Carter. The other was Marcus, looking exactly as he had 8 years ago, smiling with something that might have been relief or might have been malice. The photo deleted itself as Carter watched, pixels dissolving like snow in water. He drove home in silence, filed his report in silence, lay awake in his apartment listening to the sounds of the city, traffic, sirens, voices, and feeling a profound gratitude for their ordinary noise. For 3 weeks he did his job and spoke to his therapist and told himself he was fine. Then Harper's mother called. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she said, "but Harper's been talking in her sleep. She keeps saying your name and Marcus's name, and she says you made a choice. She says you chose to save her, but that something else was saved too. What does that mean, Ranger Reeves? What happened out there?" Carter didn't answer, because 3 nights ago he'd woken to find a text on his phone from an unknown number. "Thank you for bringing me back. The forest is hungry, but I'm hungrier. See you soon, old friend." And attached was a photo of Carter's apartment building, taken from the street below, time-stamped at 3 a.m. In the reflection of his window, 2 figures stood in his living room. Carter, asleep in bed, and Marcus, watching. Thank you for reading until the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of Marcus's fate? Was he ever real, or was it the entity all along? I'd love to hear your theories in the comments.